Brother Li, it's enough to have you with me. The terminally ill man's eyebrows and eyes are curved, just like the gorgeous starry night in summer. Even if he was in pain, he couldn't even drink a sip of water. Morley stood in front of the bed, holding his cold hand. His resolute face was grey and desperate, and he choked with almost pleading, "Don't die, please." The voice of despair made Bai Cheng's dry eyes move, and the sad eyes still showed a smile and said, "I'm gone, you have to be well. Don't eat spicy food, don't fight, eat on time, remember me, and have a new lover, but also say good things about me in front of him." The voice fell, his eyes brightened a little, and he said jokingly, "If you think of me and feel sad, you can forget it." The voice was getting softer and quieter, and the last few words were almost scattered in the air. Mo Li tightly held Bai Cheng's hand to his forehead, his shoulders trembled, he didn't want to hear this at all. He could hardly hold back his irritable emotions, and his forehead burst into blue veins, and he growled like a trapped beast, "If you die, none of your friends will have a better time. I will smash all the things you like and collect for you." He couldn't hear Bai Cheng's echo, he raised his head, but saw that Bai Cheng had closed his eyes. The instruments beside the hospital bed made a harsh noise, but his world was silent. Speaks well unable to restrain, he stood up and held Bai Cheng's shoulders, he shouted sharply with red eyes, "It's clear that we want to be together forever, Bai Cheng, why did you just leave me like that? How are you willing, how are you willing?" He is born with emotional defects, irritable and uncontrollable, and he has hurt many people since childhood. Everyone is afraid of him, only Bai Cheng is willing to stay by his side. Clinging tightly to Bai Cheng's gradually stiff and cold body, he suddenly realized that Bai Cheng was really about to disappear. The irritable expression became flustered, he panicked against Bai Cheng's face, trying to warm the person in his arms. It's a pity that this person who used to be as warm as the sun has finally cooled down completely. After the madness, there is only endless despair. Don't you want to go to college? I haven't taken you there yet, so you can wait a bit. Wake up, I beg you. In the bright ward under the incandescent light, only the desperate pleading of the man remained. But got no response. Mo Li woke up suddenly, gasping for breath, his back was soaked with cold sweat. Arrived at the place, a total of 60 yuan. Listening to the driver's urging voice, he raised his hand tiredly to cover his sour eyes, only to realize that he fell asleep just now. It has been a few days since he was born again. He went through the transfer procedures by himself and flew directly to H City. Because the White City is here. Grade 3 and 2, looking at the class sign, Mo Li carefully tidied up his sleeves and necklines and took a deep breath. Follow the head teacher to the door. There were whispering voices from the podium, Mo Li didn't care about this, he quickly looked around the classroom for a week, but did not see Bai Cheng. Others? After being absent-mindedly introduced by the head teacher, Mo Li walked off the podium and sat in the last row of vacant seats. He is a new transfer student. He doesn't have the same table and sits alone. There was an empty seat in the front row. Before he could doubt whether this was Bai Cheng's seat, the classroom door was suddenly pushed open. A teenager with a scratched face strode in, his school uniform was stained with soil, and his expression was gloomy. The teenager ignored the teacher, ignored the classmates, and sat directly in front of Mo Li without even looking at Mo Li. As if not interested in this transfer student. Mo Li held her breath, and could only hear her heart beating like a drum. This is his city. Different from the mature and stable appearance in my memory, Bai Cheng's face was still a little green at this time, and his eyes were also uninhibited only by teenagers. Mo Li's breathing became rapid, and she almost exhausted her strength to restrain herself from being impulsive. "Hello, my name is Chu Ziu, I will be my classmate from now on, just ask me if you need anything." At this moment, Bai Cheng's deskmate suddenly turned his head and whispered hello to him. I thought Mo Li, who had always been indifferent, would not respond, but Mo Li smiled at him gently, Her black eyes like jade were warm and easy, and she looked very easy to get along with. Unfortunately, Bai Cheng never meant to say hello to this transfer student. The head teacher directly chose to ignore Bai Cheng's rudeness. She just glanced here in disgust and asked everyone to open the book and prepare for class. Bai Cheng didn't mean to hold the book, he just lay down on the table and started to sleep. Seeing this, Mo Li's eyes darkened, and his fingers lightly tapped the table. The young Bai Cheng is not the same as the Bai Cheng he knew. He has to find a way to get close to White City first. I was trying to talk to Bai Cheng after class, but there were a lot of people around, chattering about his situation. Now that I am in my third year of high school, a transfer student is suddenly transferred, which makes my classmates very curious. Especially when they heard the teacher say that Mo Li is from the number 1 middle school in City A, they couldn't help being excited. City A is a big city, not a small city like them. The number 1 middle school in City A is a very famous middle school and has produced many famous people. The most important thing is that Mo Li is tall and handsome. Morley answered the students' questions with a smile. He is handsome, has a nice voice, and has a gentle attitude. Many students in the class were attracted by him. During this period, Mo Li noticed that Bai Cheng was lying on the table all the time, indifferent to the outside world. When a girl saw Mo Li paying attention to Bai Cheng's direction, she quickly lowered her voice and said, "Do not approach White City." The voice fell, but she suddenly felt as if she was being held by a knife, and her neck was cold. Looking up, Mo Li's expression didn't change. The girl just thought it was her own illusion, and whispered again, "Bai Cheng is a lunatic. He fights every time, not to mention. I heard that he killed people when he was a child." When the voice fell, Bai Cheng moved slightly, and the girl was excited. She quickly grabbed the arm of her friend next to her, and looked at him alertly. Seeing that Bai Cheng had no next move, she let out a low spit in relief. "Disgusting. Shut up." Mo Li snorted suddenly. Seeing the girl looking at him in surprise, Mo Li squinted coldly, tried his best to control his emotions, and said softly, "I don't like hearing this, so don't say it." But even so, the girl's eyes were still red. She turned around and went to the seat to cry. She was kind and Mo Li didn't appreciate it. She even yelled at her and told her to shut up. Even Chu Ziyu couldn't help but turn around and said, "Mo Li, you are not good for girls like this." Mo Li raised her eyes lazily and said lightly, "I don't like hearing her words." This means that he was reborn. If he didn't meet Bai Cheng in his previous life, this girl would have been turned into a dog by his chair. The other students looked at each other. However, Mo Li just told the girls to shut up and did nothing, and they all left after having a good relationship with the girls, but many students stayed to inquire about Mo Li's situation. When the morning passed, everyone went to have lunch in a hustle and bustle. Chu Ziyu called Mo Li, and when she saw Mo Li would not go, she left with a smile. The classroom soon quieted down, leaving only Mo Li and Bai Cheng sleeping on the table. Mo Li stared at Bai Cheng's back tightly, clenching his fists restrained, his fingertips almost sinking into his flesh. "I want to touch Bai Cheng, but I am afraid that it will be a mirror, and it will disappear. I want to laugh, but my eyes are sore." He stood up, and his eyes just fell on the clean back of Bai Cheng's neck. The Adam's apple rolled subconsciously, his teeth rubbed lightly, and somehow he remembered the touch of Bai Cheng's soft skin when he bit. "I miss it." Fingers lightly touched Bai Cheng's black and fluffy hair. Maybe his movements were too light. Bai Cheng didn't move, he was well behaved. After observing in the morning, he found that Bai Cheng in his youth was very quiet, too quiet. This is the White City he doesn't know. A city. He opened his mouth to call, and found that his voice had long been hoarse. Bai Cheng's head moved, and he looked up as if he was aware of it. Seeing that Mo Li immediately stood up on guard, he frowned and asked, "What are you doing?" When he spoke, his eyes were sharp and his tone was fierce. It was the first time that Emily heard Bai Cheng speak to him in such an unfamiliar voice. He quickly stabilized his mood and said warmly, "Want to go to lunch?" Seeing that Emily was here to remind him to eat, Bai Cheng took back his hostile gaze after a brief silence. He turned his head and responded with a lack of energy. His expression was indifferent, and people did not mean to go out. Seeing that Emily was still staring at him, he couldn't help frowning again, and said impatiently, "What are you looking at?" Like a beast guarding the territory, disobeying discipline, showing sharp claws to threaten outsiders. Bai Cheng's appearance is really good, with shining eyes and beautiful facial features. White City. Did you transfer to another school because of a disease in your brain? Bai Cheng finally smiled, but it was a sneer that didn't take people seriously. He got up and looked directly at Emily and said, "Don't mess with me." After he put on his school uniform, he pushed Emily away and went straight out. Emily didn't care either, and walked straight behind him, only to see that Bai Cheng didn't go to the cafeteria, but went directly to the rooftop. "Aren't you going to have lunch?" Emily asked again. Seeing that Emily had no intention of leaving, he helped his forehead, suddenly changed his face and grabbed Emily's collar. His eyes were as sharp as a wild wolf. "Tell you one last time, don't provoke me. Do you want to be beaten?" Other classmates were scared away when they saw his fierce look, but Emily raised his hand to grab his wrist, lowered his eyes and said stubbornly, "No lunch. If you don't eat well, your body will become bad again." Then, looking weak, he easily pulled Bai Cheng to the cafeteria. "What are you doing?" Bai Cheng was confused for this transfer student. He struggled all the way, but he didn't escape. "Why is this guy so strong? You really think I can't do it?" He growled unbearably, "Stop playing with me, haven't you heard the rumors in the class?" Emily didn't believe what the girl said to him before, but he stopped when he heard Bai Cheng say they were unfamiliar. My heart was uncomfortable, and after a long silence, I said lightly, "I'm not familiar now, why don't you go to the cafeteria?" He originally wanted to approach Bai Cheng slowly, but he did not expect to find that Bai Cheng is not good for lunch. If he can't take good care of Bai Cheng, then his rebirth will be meaningless. It's a pity that Bai Cheng didn't want to go to the cafeteria at all. He pulled his arm back and was about to speak when he saw several passing students rush past him, looking scared expression. "See, get away from me." Who knew that Emily was like a deaf man, still holding on to his wrist? "Why don't you go to the cafeteria?" Emily asked again. If Bai Cheng could do it, he would have done it long ago. Bai Cheng has never seen someone so familiar with Emily, and finally growled furiously, "I don't have the money to go to any cafeteria." The words are a little embarrassing, and I don't want to show my unbearable side to be sympathetic to others. Gritting his teeth, he didn't have the strength to eat well, and now he said more irritably, "Okay, don't bother me." He heard Emily yelling at others to shut up this morning. Maybe Emily is different from others, but he shouldn't be associated with someone like him. He will only cause trouble. After saying that, she turned around and left without looking at Emily's expression. The arm was caught by Emily before he took 2 steps. Bai Cheng only felt that the veins on his forehead were jumping, and he was about to scold the 18 generations of the Moli family. "By the way, I don't know where the cafeteria is, can you take me there?" Not waiting for Bai Cheng to get angry, Emily followed closely. In return, "Can I invite you to lunch?" Bai Cheng's thoughts moved, but he still refused indifferently, "You can ask others." Being rejected again and again, Emily seemed to finally give up and let go. Bai Cheng breathed a sigh of relief and was about to leave when he heard Emily say behind him, "Actually, I changed schools because I was bullied by the school." Hearing this, Bai Cheng paused and looked back. I saw Emily lowered his head, his dark eyes dimmed. When he spoke, Emily tugged at the sleeve of his school uniform, raised his head, and said in a low voice, "So I want to be nice to my classmates at the new school, so that I won't be bullied again, but I didn't expect it to make you unhappy, sorry. The best way to approach someone who is wary is to resonate with them first. He is also gambling. The soft-hearted nature of gambling White City will not change. Sure enough, Beicheng hesitated for a while, but his voice was still bad. You know, I almost thought there was something wrong with you. That's what they said, but the other person turned around, took a few steps in the opposite direction, frowned and said impatiently, aren't you going to the cafeteria, can you hurry up? Emily hurriedly followed, and the dark eyes were gradually replaced by a deep smile. Before he met Beicheng in his last life, his manic symptoms became more and more serious, and he no longer knew how many people he had hurt. Until he met Beicheng, who took the initiative to take care of him. At that time, he still couldn't control himself, picked up the chair and hurt Beicheng. But Beicheng still gave him all the tenderness. You'll be fine, I'll help you. At that time, Beicheng still had traces of being hurt by him, but his expression was very serious, and his voice was as light and sweet as water, which was better than anything else. Emily returned to reality from memory and looked up at Beicheng, who had stopped. Here, you can go by yourself. Beicheng glanced at the door of the cafeteria that was close at hand, and had no intention of entering, so he turned and left. Emily wanted to hold him, but he was afraid that he would be disgusted, so he retracted his hand and quickly said, "Can I treat you to dinner?" "No." Beicheng frowned, not wanting to get too close to Emily. If he is close to Emily, Emily will definitely be excluded by other classmates. The eyes of Emily, who was rejected again, were a little hurt, and she lowered her head and said sadly, "I really still annoy you, right?" When Yan Beicheng took a deep breath, kicked the ground irritably, and felt that his tone was a little fierce. He told himself that he couldn't bully such a poor little one, took a deep breath, and decided to let Emily recognize the reality, knowing that being with him only has disadvantages and no benefits. Shaking his head, he finally followed Emily into the cafeteria. The originally noisy cafeteria became quiet the moment Beicheng entered, and then many people looked over here. God, did you see his expression, so fierce? Why did he come to the cafeteria? It's dirty. Emily paused at his feet, looked around, and found that many people were looking at them, to be precise, looking at Beicheng. These sights are full of malice. I thought Beicheng didn't come to the cafeteria just because he didn't have money, but now, looking at the attitude of the people around him, in this hostile environment, he didn't like coming. He didn't know about Beicheng's high school life. Beicheng seldom mentioned this time in his previous life. Fortunately, now there is an opportunity to know. Beicheng is used to the gossip around him, his face is still gloomy and indifferent, and the scratches on his face make him look even more fierce. He knew that others would be uncomfortable when they saw him, so he didn't plan to eat in the cafeteria. When I got to the rooftop, I found that Emily was still following me. How do you? He frowned fiercely, remembering what happened to Emily, gritted his teeth and tried to speak softly. You also saw that since you want to get along well with other students, stay away from me. Emily didn't say anything, just lowered his head and ate quietly, looking very shy. Looking at his dead-skinned Beicheng, it's not good to really blow people off the rooftop, and he was hungry too, so he leaned against the shade of the rooftop and ate quietly. Little did she know that Emily's eyes kept falling on him. The fierce Beicheng is very different from the Beicheng he knows, but whether it is the soft-hearted nature or the quiet appearance when eating, it has not changed at all. Look at what I'm doing, you won't eat. Beicheng quickly found that Emily was staring at him in a trance and stared at Emily coldly. Emily shook his head and shoved the rice, but his eyes fell on a void somewhere. Why is Beicheng isolated? Because of rumors or something else? Is that why he didn't go to college? He knows that Beicheng has no parents, no relatives, and it is not impossible for him to give up his studies if he is forced by school pressure and financial pressure. After chewing slowly, he seemed to inquire about the situation at Bai Cheng's house unintentionally. Do you have a brother? He knew that Bai Cheng had no brothers, so he just opened his mouth to try. Yes. Bai Cheng raised his eyes. Yes? Mo Li was taken aback. I have a brother. Bai Cheng's eyes brightened when he talked about his younger brother. He stretched out his hand and gestured, about 1 meter high, so tall, this year is 12 years old, and he is going to junior high school. It doesn't look like Bai Cheng is lying at all, but Mo Li has never heard Bai Cheng mention it. He suddenly realizes that there are more things he didn't know in his last life than he thought. Bai Cheng saved him in his last life, but he never did anything for Bai Cheng. Perhaps she was in a good mood now. Bai Cheng glanced at Mo Li and said casually, Are you in a? Mo Li was taken away from his thoughts when he heard the words. He was a little stunned, but he still smiled and said, You know. Listening to Mo Li's questioning Bai Cheng's face, he frowned and said, Didn't you say it when you got out of class? Morley spread her hands, I thought you had been sleeping. Hearing this, Bai Cheng seemed to laugh, and the very shallow smile disappeared in a blink of an eye. He turned his head twice and finished his meal, leaned against the guardrail and closed his eyes in the sun. Since you're in such a good school, why do you want to transfer? When Bai Cheng closed his eyes, Mo Li's gaze couldn't help but fall on his light-colored thin lips. After a while, he looked away and sat beside Bai Cheng, leaning against the guardrail and looking up, and continued, For someone important. Bai Cheng pulled the corners of his mouth and snorted, mocking himself a little, but did not reply. Seeing that Bai Cheng is in a good mood now, Mo Li tentatively asked, What about you, why are you fighting? The wounds on Bai Cheng's body are from the fight. Unfortunately, Bai Cheng just glanced at him irritably and didn't answer. In class in the afternoon, Chu Ziyu remembered seeing Bai Cheng in the cafeteria at noon, pouted and whispered towards Bai Cheng, Did you go to the cafeteria at noon? I heard that you asked Mo Li to help you cook, isn't it too much? Anyway, it's class now, and he doesn't believe that Bai Cheng really dares to do something to him. Sure enough, although Bai Cheng, who was lying on the table, opened his eyes and glanced at him coldly, he did not respond at all. White City. At the same time, the math teacher noticed that Bai Cheng was sleeping, called Bai Cheng, patted the blackboard and said, Have you slept enough? Tell me how to solve the fifth big problem. Bai Cheng moved slowly, stood up and read the book, pursed his lips, shook his head and said, I don't know. The teachers didn't like Bai Cheng, who failed every subject. Whoever thought Bai Cheng raised his eyes and said, I'm going to work, not college. Hearing this, the math teacher only felt that the mud in Bai Cheng could not support the wall, and trembled with anger, promising. Then call Bai Cheng to sit down. Students say they are going to work, what else can their teachers say? This waste is a waste of time. I don't want to see a boy in the class suddenly laughing and saying, Teacher, what can a murderer's son do? The voice fell into silence after work, and then a few people laughed softly. Bai Cheng stood in the sight of everyone's ridicule, and his expression remained unchanged, just as if he hadn't heard of Yunko, Ltd. Mo Li squeezed the pen. The son of a murderer? Everything is quiet. The math teacher frowned, What nonsense, go to class. I'm right. The boy didn't know how to restrain himself, stood up and looked straight at Bai Cheng, pointed at him and said sharply, My mother knows that there is a murderer's son in the class, and she is nervous about me every day. Why does this kind of scourge want to go to school with us? At this time, a girl also said, and I also heard that Bai Cheng also killed people when he was a child. He was not sentenced because he was too young. His father is still in prison. In the third year of high school, every student is very sensitive. In addition to studying a lot every day, they have to beware of Bai Cheng approaching, and they are annoying. Bai Cheng still pretended not to hear. No matter what others say, he will mostly endure it silently. The circumstances of his family do not allow him to be self-willed, even if it is a simple fight with these students, he cannot bear the consequences. Clenched his fists, listened to the mockery and abuse in his ears, and sat down. His silent attitude suddenly made these people more mad, and some even coaxed Bai Cheng to drop out of school quickly. The cacophony was loud and harsh. Classmates! At this moment, Murray stood up. The noisy voice of the class was silent for a moment. Everyone looked at Mo Li in unison, not understanding what he was doing when he suddenly stood up. Classmates! Mo Li called out again, smiled harmlessly at the boy who started talking, and the dark eyes easily attracted everyone's attention like a black hole. Then saw him holding the thick question book in his hand. The smile in his eyes was instantly cold to freezing, the corners of his mouth were still bent, and the question book had been thrown towards the boy's face. The tutorial book with the hard cover directly hit the boy in the face, the paper in the middle was torn apart by Mo Li, and it flew in a mess. Someone screamed. No one thought that Mo Li, who was still smiling just now, would make such a crazy move. The boy was hit in the nose, covered his face in pain, looked up at Mo Li Kong and smiled. I don't want to go to school with the animals. How about letting your mother reincarnate as a person in the next life? The class fell silent after a brief riot, and everyone stared at Mo Li with a look of horror. The math teacher was originally just angry, but now his eyes darkened and he almost fainted. New classmate. He hadn't remembered Mo Li's name, so he could only say loudly, how can you hit someone? The teacher, why is he insulting people? Mo Li didn't think there was anything wrong with his own actions, the corners of his mouth rose, and he asked casually. The math teacher was at a loss for words. Bai Cheng is not good at studying, but the boy's study is among the best and he is hopeful to be admitted to the key point. Selfishly, he will definitely be biased. What's more, the boy just said something unpleasant without causing any substantial harm. But this is not easy to say in front of everyone. He glared at Mo Li, and could only show the majesty of the teacher. Do you have a reason to hit someone? Mo Li lowered his eyes and moved his wrists, without answering. His attitude was sloppy. In fact, he still thought that the boy was lucky. He was really going to break his head just now, but now he just hit his nose, and there was no bleeding yet, so there was nothing to shout about. People in City H don't know Mo Li, but in City A, who doesn't know Mo Li? In a place like City A where the children of rich families gather, anyone who sees Mo Li has to call Li Ge tremblingly. Can such Mo Li watch Bai Cheng be bullied? Seeing that someone in the class started talking, the math teacher took a long time to look back at the boy who was beaten and said anxiously, quiet for me, how are you Su Jie? Su Jie's tears of pain were falling, but fortunately there was no nosebleed, he could only point at Mo Li with a sullen voice, I'm going to tell my mother to go. Go. Mo Li said lightly, remember to forward my words to you. Su Jie almost lost his temper. While Bai Cheng in the front row looked at the scene in front of him in surprise, frowning, never expecting the shy and quiet Mo Li to stand up for himself. After class, Mo Li was called by the math teacher to the office to criticize, and I heard that he had to write a review. When he came back, the classmates in the class were silent, intentionally or not, and Chu Ziu, who was still very enthusiastic, also looked at him with a strange look. Murray just acted like nothing happened and what to do. When school was over, Bai Cheng stopped Mo Li, and when everyone in the class left, he said uncomfortably, thank you. After saying that, he raised his eyelids, trying to make his attitude seem cold, and said, but I'm used to it, you don't have to stand up for me, or others will alienate you. I just did what I wanted to do. Mo Li shook his head, put his school bag on his back and said gently, do you want to go together? Today Mo Li helped him, and Bai Cheng couldn't refuse, so he nodded and followed Mo Li. Seeing this, Mo Li slowed down and walked side by side with Bai Cheng. The two are of similar height, so if you only look at their appearance, they are very eye-catching. Mo had a smile on his face, but he felt sorry for Bai Cheng, and didn't understand why Bai Cheng would endure those people. In his impression, Bai Cheng's skills are good. Although he is soft-hearted, he is not the kind of person who can be bullied. Bai Cheng didn't know what Mo was thinking at this time, but just extended his hand to him after leaving the school. Mo was stunned for a moment, but did not respond. "Give me the manuscript paper, and I will help you write a review." Bai Cheng frowned, a little impatient. He didn't have any extra money to buy manuscript paper, so Mo bought a new book to write a review. Mo then reacted. He first laughed softly, and then he seemed to be unable to restrain his laughter, the more impudent he was. "The stupid look really hasn't changed at all. As long as you treat him a little bit better, he will be able to pay back 100-fold. At this moment, Bai Cheng was horrified by the laughter, and his temper came up. "What are you laughing at?" Mo held back a smile and raised his eyes to look at Bai Cheng, met his eyes full of anger, and handed the manuscript to Bai Cheng. Wrote in a very good mood, "Okay, here you go." When Bai Cheng writes it, he can take the opportunity to see how Bai Cheng's language is, and pick up bad sentences by the way. Bai Cheng angrily snatched the manuscript paper and stuffed it into his school bag, and angrily stepped forward to go alone, and when he looked back, he saw Mo was still following him, and couldn't help but say angrily, "Where is your home?" Mo honestly reported an address. "This place." Bai Cheng frowned and said displeasedly, "Isn't it just opposite the school? What are you doing with me?" Of course Mo wanted to follow him, and he wished he would never be separated again. Just before he could speak, a man suddenly appeared in front of him, with a thin body and a big gold chain around his neck, and he hit him straight. Seeing Mo sideways to avoid, the man whistled, raised his hand to reveal the large tattoo on his arm, and said, "Little classmate, you bullied my brother." "Brother?" Mo thought for a while, then moved his eyes lazily to look at Sujie who was standing behind the man, and said with a smile, "Sujie. I didn't expect this guy to look useless, and it's quite neat to find someone." "You're finished," Sujie said proudly. He couldn't bear the anger of being smashed by Mo, so he called his brother from the society he knew after class. The young people in the society were completely unaware of the interest in Mo's eyes, and they showed the dragon and tiger tattoos on their arms, proudly saying, "I'm the brother he recognizes on the road, who can't you provoke him?" Unconsciously, Mo and Bai Cheng were surrounded by everyone. Mo moved his fingers, and was about to move his fists, but Bai Cheng, who was beside him, suddenly flew up and kicked the young man's stomach directly. He dragged Mo and ran while the others hadn't reacted. Bai Cheng's physical fitness has always been good, dragging Mo away from the people who were chasing him. As he ran, he turned around and asked Mo, "Can you run?" Mo's stamina is no worse than Bai Cheng's, but he glanced at Bai Cheng worried about his sight, and when he moved, he said a hypocritical sentence, "I can't run anymore." As long as he was tired in his last life, Bai Cheng would carry him away. But Bai Cheng is not that familiar with Mo yet, so he had to slow down and drag Mo into a nearby clothing store when he turned a corner. Watching the young people run past in the store, Bai Cheng breathed a sigh of relief. "Sorry." His indifferent face became a little more guilty, looked at Mo and said, "Because of me, you were targeted by them." Mo didn't care, but his eyes fell on Bai Cheng's sleeve. "Your clothes are torn. It should have been accidentally hung somewhere when I ran it just now." He just said it casually, but Bai Cheng's face turned pale. I saw Bai Cheng raised his hand and pressed the scratch on his sleeve. He didn't know what to think. He shook his head and said anxiously, "Damn, I'm leaving first." Seeing his cold and alienated expression, Mo stopped his hand for a while, worried that it was too late. He hesitated for a moment and could only whisper, then, "See you tomorrow." I don't know if Bai Cheng, who ran away, heard it. Bai Cheng's home is in an ordinary residential building. He first stopped in the corridor, rubbed his face to ease his expression, and then went upstairs with the key to open the door. Brother. As soon as I entered the door, I welcomed my baby brother. Xiaojing, is mom back? Bai Cheng's voice was gentle. He squatted down and hugged Beijing while looking at the room. Bai Jing shook his head, touched Bai Cheng's face with his small hand and said softly, "Brother, someone beat you? Does it hurt?" While talking, he approached Bai Cheng to blow air on his face. "It's okay, it doesn't hurt." Bai Cheng breathed a sigh of relief, rubbed Beijing's head and asked him to do his homework, and at the same time hurriedly took off his school uniform and let Beijing Fang hide in the room, so that his mother would not find out. I hurried to the kitchen and started cooking. When the meal was ready, their mother Sunya finally came back. Sunya's face was as tired as ever. She lowered her head and put down the bag on her shoulders, and looked up to see Bai Cheng smiling gently while cooking. "The meal is almost ready today, thank you for your hard work." Bai Cheng's eyes followed her, and they were gentle like water when they were bent. "Well, hard work mom." Different from outside, Bai Cheng restrained his indifferent shell with thorns, and his expression was soft. The prepared meal was served on the table, and the family of three quietly began to eat. It's just that unlike Bai Cheng, Bai Jing has been watching Sunya cautiously, clearly hungry but still chewing, not even daring to eat. Sunya was nothing out of the ordinary, eating quietly, occasionally raising her head and smiling at the two of them. "There are very few people who collect debts during this time," she said lightly. Bai Cheng's eyes paused, trying to stabilize his emotions, and comforting, "We have paid off the money, those people will not come again." "Pay off?" Hearing this, Sunya seemed to be very relieved. When she finished eating, Bai Cheng quickly stood up and asked, "Mom, is it enough? Do you want another bowl?" Sunya doesn't eat much now, but she may have a little appetite today, but she nodded. Just as I was about to hand the bowl to Bai Cheng, my fingertips suddenly slipped, and the bowl hit the table and rolled to the ground. The accident happened suddenly. The next moment Beijing was horrified. He almost got up and hid behind Bai Cheng. "How can you even turn the bowl against me?" The short silence was followed by a sharp roar, which cut through the calm appearance just now. Sunya's face, who was still gentle just now, distorted in an instant, and suddenly became angry and stepped on the broken bowl. "Mom!" Bai Cheng was startled, and quickly stopped Sunya's movements to clean up the debris, who knew that Sunya raised his hand and slapped him in the face. "What are you doing? Are you going to have a hard time with me?" Sunya raised her hand to fan again, and shouted sharply, "I have to take care of the two of you, I have to go to work to pay off my debts, and I have to bear the finger-pointing of those messy people. It's all your dad's fault, it's all your fault, you two oil bottles." I know. Bai Cheng knew that Sunya was under enormous pressure every day, so he could only soften his voice and hold Sunya's hand, whispering to comfort, "Mom, calm down, the shards will scratch you don't know." Sunya roared and threw away Bai Cheng's hand, irritably threw everything that could be smashed at her two sons. "I'm so tired, I'm really good tired. You don't know anything but blood from me." This is not enough, she also screamed like a vent, and kicked Bai Cheng after she had nothing to throw in her hands. "You still don't go to school well, and you dare to fight, do you think I didn't see the injury on your face? You will cause me trouble." Seeing this, Bai Cheng knew that Sunya would not calm down for the time being, so he could only turn around and hug Bai Jing first. Bai Jing's small eyes were full of fear, trembling in fear, but he didn't dare to cry. He could only bury his head in Bai Cheng's arms and shed tears silently. I don't know how long it took. Sunya's uncontrollable emotions finally calmed down. She stared blankly at the mess in the room, and slowly squatted down holding her head. "I'm sorry," she hoarsely said, and began to burst into tears. Bai Cheng's back hurt badly, but he got up quietly and began to clean up the mess in the room. First coax Bai Jing back to the room, then pour a basin of water and wipe Sunya's hand. Good boy. Sunya leaned against the sofa without strength, and smiled wearily. I'm dragging you down again. Send Sunya back to the room to rest. Bai Cheng continued to clean up the house in the living room alone. Squatted down to pick up the glass shards on the ground, and when his sleeves were accidentally stained with the soup on the ground, he quickly got up to rinse. Just standing by the pool, rubbed her eyes silently. He can't cry. Life is not yet bitter enough to cry. Bai Cheng washed his face, quickly packed up and returned to his room, only to see Bai Jing sitting on the edge of the bed, hugging his legs and whimpering softly. Seeing that someone pushed the door in, Bai Jing raised his head in fear, and saw that it was Bai Cheng's tears before continuing to fall. Brother, shall we escape? Mom always beats us. He was so sad that he trembled as he spoke. Other families have gentle parents. Only he has nothing. He glanced at the books on the table, and paused. I will go to work as soon as I graduate from high school, and then the pressure on my mother will not be as great as it is now. She will turn into the original gentle appearance. I'm going to work too. Bai Jing said quickly. No, you have to study hard. Bai Cheng scratched his nose, and his face became stern. Your brother, I have nothing to do, and my grades are not good. You can't learn from me. Bai Jing puffed out a small face, his eyes were still red, and he pouted reluctantly, but brother, your grades in junior high school are obviously very good. It won't work until high school, many don't understand. Bai Cheng said casually, sitting at the desk with Bai Jing in his arms, watching him look wronged for a while, rubbing his head and saying, I came back with good grades in the final exam this time. My brother will treat you to something delicious. Who would have thought that? Bai Jing rubbed his tearful eyes, lowered his head and muttered, you lie to children. He knew that the money from Bai Cheng's part-time job on weekends was used to buy vegetables, and he didn't have much money left on him. Bai Cheng couldn't help laughing out loud, and reassured that he would definitely treat him to delicious Bai Jing before he finally opened the book and read it with a very reluctant expression. Watching Bai Jing come out from the shadow of fear and start reading, Bai Cheng found the needle and thread, lowered his head and sewed the torn school uniform. Their father went to prison in his third year of junior high school, and it is not easy for his mother to persist until now. So even if his mother did something to him, he would not hate him. With him, I won't let my mother hurt my brother. He will protect my brother and my mother. Opening his mouth and biting off the thread, he put down the school uniform and touched the words on the back of the school uniform. Thinking about Sunya's situation getting worse and worse, he felt that he might not be able to wait for graduation. Anyway, his grades are not good now, and he will only make other students feel uncomfortable in school. It is better to drop out of school and work part-time to make money first. I don't know why he suddenly remembered that Mo Li was also for others and gave up the best learning environment with teachers. For a while, he felt that the two of them were in a similar situation. Thinking of Mo Li, I remembered the review he was going to write for Mo Li, pulled up a chair and sat beside Bai Jing, and started writing after I made the draft in my heart. The first year of high school couldn't find a part-time job outside because of his young age. In order to make money, he helped others to write reviews and the like, and he has rich experience. Bai Jing on the side glanced at Bai Cheng's handwritten characters, and then looked at his own dog-crawling characters, silently biting the pen. I didn't know what I was thinking, my eyes were wet all of a sudden, and I eagerly looked at Bai Cheng Road. Brother, am I really a dragging oil bottle? Bai Cheng's subordinates paused, poked Bai Jing's head with his left hand, and said with a straight face, what nonsense, my brother Bai Cheng is better than anyone else, do you know? Bai Jing's eyes lit up immediately after hearing this, and he threw himself into Bai Cheng's arms and hugged him tightly. The brother wants to stay with me all the time, he said coquettishly. Okay. Bai Cheng rubbed his head and laughed. The next day, Bai Cheng first handed the review to Mo Li, and then he began to lose his mind as usual, thinking about dropping out of school all morning. Because of the supportive policies of the Chinese state, in his situation, as long as he attends the school, he will have a social minimum subsidy. In fact, it doesn't cost much for tuition and book fees. The most expensive is mainly the questions books that need to be used in Senior 3. He knew that he could not go to university and his grades were not good, so he never bought one. It's not a big loss if you drop out now. I made up my mind secretly, but when I returned to my senses, I found that all my classmates had left, and it was time for lunch break again. I was about to get up and leave when Emily suddenly sat next to him and brought him a bento. "This is for you." Emily smiled at him familiarly, his voice was shy, and he looked a little nervous. Bei Cheng glanced at the peach heart bento in the lunch box, his eyelids jumped, and he gave Emily a blank look. "I made it myself." Seeing Bei Cheng looking at him and thinking he didn't like it, Emily could only helplessly say, "If you don't want to go to the cafeteria, don't go, I made 2 lunch boxes for each of us." 1. During the period when Bei Cheng was sick, Emily, who had never cooked, learned almost all the dishes he could cook, but was worried that he would not be able to cook what Bei Cheng wanted to eat. "No." Bei Cheng frowned and said coldly. "He only cooks breakfast for Beijing and Sunya in the morning, he doesn't eat it himself, usually only eats 1 dinner a day. But, not to the point of eating other people's food for nothing." Seems to have noticed Bei Cheng's deliberate estrangement. Emily opened the lunchbox. Although he looked docile, his eyes were pitiful. I really don't know whether Emily is shy or cheeky. Usually, he doesn't dare to raise his head when he talks, and his eyes are erratic, but no matter how cold Bei Cheng is, Emily doesn't care. Seeing Bei Cheng hesitantly move in his seat, Emily thought about it and added, "Just take it as your reward for writing the review for me yesterday, you won't eat it now, it will spoil after the next meal." When Yan Bei Cheng was silent for a few seconds, as if he didn't want Emily to be too embarrassed, he finally used his chopsticks to pick up the peach heart that was cut from something unknown. "It tastes good after a bite." He eats it like a carrot, but it feels sour and sweet, very appetizing. Seeing him eating obediently, Emily was also happy. Bei Cheng admits that the taste is good, but after seeing Tao Xin, who was bitten, she couldn't help but ask, "Why make this shape?" He could see that each heart was carefully decorated, and the careful placement was impeccable. "I followed the online tutorial, and the tutorial taught it like this, so I did it." Emily was righteous. Seeing this, Bei Cheng couldn't say anything. However, he was still surprised to find that this bento, from the taste to the dishes, was all his favorite. Damn it! Maybe she felt a little closer to Emily psychologically, and coupled with her short cannibalistic mouth, Bei Cheng finally gave Emily a good face, at least her voice was much gentler when she spoke. Just as they were about to finish eating, Emily suddenly said, "I read the review you wrote for me, the words are all very good, and your language is good." He didn't forget that he still wanted Bei Cheng to go to university when he was reborn. To help Bei Cheng study, he must first understand Bei Cheng's shortcomings and advantages. Listening to his casual question, Bei Cheng didn't feel relieved, just shook his head and said, "I didn't pass." This is the truth. Bei Cheng's studies have plummeted since high school. Just as Emily was thinking for a moment to answer, Bei Cheng suddenly said in a low voice, "But it doesn't matter, I'm going to drop out anyway." What Emily wanted to say suddenly came to his lips. "Why?" he asked after a while. Bei Cheng turned his head, looked a little irritable, and said impatiently, "There is no reason, just can't learn, don't want to go." He felt that Emily's grades should be good, and he didn't expect Emily to understand that he would wash the lunch box when he got up. Whoever wanted Emily took his arm, raised his head and asked, "Don't you want to go to college? University?" Bei Cheng was only a little dazed when he heard the word, and then laughed at himself. Since high school he has never dreamed of going to college. Let's not talk about tuition fees, just because of his family's situation, how can he be assured to leave Beijing by Sun Yu's side? There are more and more things that distract him, and he no longer listens to lectures in class, just because he is afraid of delusions that he should not have. I don't want to, he said. I didn't want to take a few steps when I heard Emily quietly say behind him, if you are short of money, do you want to come after school to clean my house every day? I will pay you 50 a day, plus a lunch. He stopped subconsciously and turned around to see Emily lying on the table with his chin on the back of his hand, with a negotiating attitude. Seeing him looking at him, Emily raised his head slightly, his eyes reflected brilliance, and his tone was cautious, don't drop out of school, okay? The boy lying on the table was bathed in the sun, his smiling eyes looked at him sincerely, like a painting dyed with bright colors. After a long time, Bei Cheng can still remember this scene. But now he just shook his head for a short time, feeling a little dazzling and looking away. Why did Emily help him? This inexplicable kindness only made him uneasy. No one treats others unconditionally. When he was hesitating about how to answer, the classroom door was suddenly pushed open, and a few classmates came back after lunch laughing. Who knew that as soon as the door opened, they saw Bei Cheng? Why is Bei Cheng still in the classroom at this time? I wonder if they have a lunch break. Their expressions showed a little weirdness and disgust, and then they continued to talk and laugh as if they didn't see it. Taking advantage of this opportunity, Bei Cheng turned around and went out without saying anything. Emily's expression froze for a while when Bei Cheng turned to leave. He almost subconsciously touched the calming medicine in his pocket, but he felt empty. I remembered that I had been reborn now, and I had the opportunity to see Bei Cheng again, and my gradually irritable and wanting to hurt people was forcibly suppressed. Of course he won't let Bei Cheng go alone, he quickly followed, and before leaving the house, he noticed that many in the class were quietly looking at him. Bei Cheng stood by the pool and helped Emily wash the lunch box earnestly. Seeing that he was still a little uncomfortable, he said without raising his head, wait for me to wash it, and then wipe it with a clean toilet paper after you go back, it will not be oily. Emily didn't make a sound, just walked silently to the tap, took the lunch box from Bei Cheng, and washed his head down very seriously. I can wash. Noticing Bei Cheng's gaze, he whispered, I can cook, wash dishes, and take care of people, but I don't like to clean up the room. He spent countless days and nights alone in luxurious and beautiful houses, breaking and destroying everything that he saw. This is his wedding room. But the man who was supposed to be with him is gone. Looking up at the mirror in front of the pool, he opened his mouth, looked at Bei Cheng quietly, and said, can't you really consider my proposal? Bei Cheng keenly sensed that the emotions in Emily's words were a bit strange. He didn't know why he couldn't meet Emily's eyes, he could only look away and said, I really don't need it, thank you. Morley is a good man, but his heart should be used on more worthy people. I'm about to drop out of school, it's not worth it. While speaking, he gently rubbed the wound on his face with his palm, regained his indifferent expression, and turned to leave. He was going to the rooftop, but probably because of trance, he walked back to the classroom unconsciously. As soon as I entered the door, I noticed something was wrong, and I raised my eyes just to meet the line of sight of the supervisor. The squad leader's name is Wu Shi. His name sounds feminine, but he is actually a thin boy with black-rimmed glasses. He is also Su Jia's good brother. What are you doing? Get out! Wu Shi stared at Bei Cheng, he put down the textbook while he was endorsing, stood up and said in disgust, didn't you say, people like you are not allowed to stay in the classroom during your lunch break? It's really annoying. A girl sitting at the door also glanced at Bei Cheng when she heard the words, and muttered dissatisfiedly, what are you going to do and come back, disturbing our lunch break? Bei Cheng couldn't help but glance at the girl when he heard the words, but his eyes were not sharp but inexplicably had a sense of oppression, which scared the girl to a shiver. Seeing the girl looking at him alertly, Bai Cheng turned around without saying anything and went out again. It's terrible, isn't he going to hit me? The girl hurriedly complained to the other classmates. Emily came back after a while, and it was a little strange to see that there was no Bai Cheng in the classroom. He clearly saw Bai Cheng walking towards the classroom before. The students in the class didn't speak when they saw Emily come in, at most they just raised their eyes. Emily didn't pay attention to these people at all, just leaned against the door and tapped the table of the girl sitting at the door. The girl who was secretly reading the novel raised her head and saw Emily hurriedly smiled. New classmate, what's the matter? Have you come back from Bai Cheng? Emily asked directly. The girl's expression froze. She didn't expect Emily to ask about Bai Cheng as soon as she came. She hurriedly glanced at the squad leader, and seeing that Wu Shi seemed to have heard the movement, she quickly frowned and said, "Don't mention Bai Cheng." Emily didn't move his face towards her evasive attitude, just lowered his eyelids slightly, to conceal his true emotions. Why? Everyone doesn't like him. Our class is the top class. Bai Cheng's grades in the middle school entrance examination and the first year of high school are better. The current grades in our class are a hindrance. The girl thought for a while, replied calmly. Although her expression is very reserved, she can still see a faint sense of superiority and dissatisfaction, and he is very fierce, and he beats people. With him, everyone must be trembling, and even the class style is broken. If it weren't for our school only divides classes once in the first year of high school, early drive him away. Hearing these words, Emily rarely lost his temper, but just retracted his hand in front of the table, opened the zipper of the school uniform and exhaled, his light brown eyes quenched a bit cold. He was worried that if he put his hand on the table again, it would be thrown off the table. When it was quiet, Emily was tall and cool, standing in front of the table somewhat casually, leaning against the wall with his left shoulder, a pocket in one hand, and his eyes looking straight at him. Being watched so intently, how could the girl have the courage to meet Emily's gaze? She quickly looked away, her heartbeat quickened a lot. As for Emily, who lived nearly 10 years longer than these children, she just saw the girl's mood at a glance. He lowered his eyes, just wanting to hear the girl continue to talk about Bai Cheng. Seeing that the girl was just staring at him and not speaking, he took the initiative to say, "Has Bai Cheng done anything to others? Moved?" This time, it was not the girl who responded, but the girl's desk mate. He heard the topic of the two and raised his head with interest. His voice was especially loud in the quiet classroom during the lunch break. It seems that he found himself making a noise with other students during their lunch break. He turned around and apologized to the students behind him with his hands folded, and then lowered his voice and said to Emily, "Bai Cheng and Sujia had a fight in the second year of high school. Sujia's family background is very good, and there is a social cover outside. I was still beaten to death by Bai Cheng." The boy was a little excited when he talked about this kind of thing, but he was worried about Sujia, and still whispered, "At that time, although Bai Cheng rarely spoke and was very quiet, he still if we can get along, we all thought that the school bully of number 6 middle school was going to be replaced. As a result, hey, it's a pity to die idiot Chi, what did you say?" Just as the boy was talking with gusto, a sound suddenly came from his side. The boy was excited, and when he turned his head, he saw that Sujia was pointing at him with a gel pen. Although he was smiling, his eyes were obviously different. That means. Seeing him look over, Sujia threw the pen on the table, stood up and sneered, "Be quiet, I can't even sleep if I want." Bai Kuzi smiled awkwardly, and quickly covered her mouth and made a silent gesture. Very satisfied with his approach, Sujia slowly turned his eyes to Emily. Emily looked at him calmly, still looking lazy, leaning against the wall without standing. The squad leader Wu Shi saw this, his eyes moved, and he also stood up and said, "Emily, although you are a new transferee, you must follow the rules of our school. It's lunch break. Go back to your seat to rest and don't disturb others." His voice was not small, and several students who were doing the questions looked up at him, but said nothing. Emily didn't seem to hear such a big movement. Except for looking at it, he didn't even move a finger. Sujiya has stood up and walked to Emily, pushing him hard. At the same time, Sujiya was ready for Emily to resist. Who knew that Emily had changed his arrogant attitude before, and was still silent after being pushed against the wall behind him? He just glanced at him, and the look in his eyes was incomprehensible. What kind of eyes do you have? Sujiya was inexplicably upset, grabbed Emily's collar and roared fiercely. It's nothing. Emily stared at Sujiya, his voice was emotionless. In fact, he was just using the joy of cutting off people's hands and feet and smashing other people's heads in his previous life, thinking seriously about how to make Sujiya disappear more beautifully. Otherwise, there will be too many waves that will affect Akin's schooling. Before he met Beicheng, he always used this method to relieve the irritability that the medicine could not control. Emily's indifferent attitude was no different from provocation in Sujiya's eyes. Are you so proud that you ran away last night? I tell you, it's your luck, don't think I'll let you go. Sujiya's cheeks tensed, his eyes wide open and his expression twisted. When he spoke, his eyes swept across Baikazi's face, and when he saw Baikazi, he immediately lowered his head to read the book, and then focused on Emily's face again. I just heard what he said, I'm not someone you can provoke, I don't care which city you are from, if you have the kind of book to throw at me. Hearing this, Baikazi snorted in his heart, and looked at Emily cautiously with his head lowered, for fear that they would really fight. He actually don't want to see what happened to Beicheng happen to Emily again. Unexpectedly, Emily, who dared to smash Sujiya directly with a book in front of everyone yesterday, is now like a wilted gun battle, just looking at Sujiya without making a sound out. Seeing his weak and bullying appearance, Sujiya was puzzled at first, and then quickly realized that Emily was afraid. Think about it too, he has a good family background, he always likes it, and he knows people in society, which student is not afraid? However, I didn't expect Emily to be so useless, and he was afraid of being scared. I was contemptuous in my heart, and I relaxed my strength, and looked back at Wu Shi. Wu Shi put down the phone hidden in his cuff, and his body relaxed. They originally planned to take pictures of Emily if he did it. The last time Emily smashed Sujiya with a book, it was revealed after a review, who would be willing to change it. So this time, they deliberately left evidence for the teacher to see. If the teacher's punishment is not what they want, they will show it to the principal. In short, they must make Emily suffer a lot. Who knew Emily was cowardly this time? Sujiya rubbed his brows, thinking that he was really ridiculous, and he spent so much thought on dealing with a coward. Release Emily, he sneered again, turned around and patted Baikazi's table hard before saying, Idiot Chi, keep your mouth shut, this is the last time. Baikazi nodded quickly. Seeing this, Sujiya was very satisfied and pushed Emily's shoulder again, and went out in a good mood. Although she is now in her third year of high school, Sujiya doesn't like to stay at school at noon and will go to the internet cafe to play for an hour. He studied well anyway. As soon as the others walked away, Baikazi immediately changed their cowardly behavior, turned their eyes smartly, gave Emily a thumbs up, and said in a very low voice, You did the right thing. Don't confront Sujiya, don't you just let them say a few words, just bear with it and let it pass. Emily's peripheral vision was retracted from Wu Shi, and he smiled without knowing what he thought of. These kids are pretty good at playing, if he can't see what's hidden in his sleeves, right?